We're connecting and welcome to everybody to this webinar launching the paper that the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition has produced over the last 9 months. Border carbon adjustment in the EU issues and options. We are now kind of letting people join the webinar. The numbers are, at least on paper, relatively high, over 500 people. So we'd like to give it 1 or 2 minutes past the hour to make sure that everyone is able to join the conference from the very beginning. At that point, I will introduce the speakers, and then we're on our way. We're about, I guess the panelists can see we're about 1:45 right now or so. So we'll see where the numbers go. I think that what I'm not seeing is Joachim Schuster or Holger Losch not joining, so I'm a little bit concerned about that. Mr. Schuster, thank you for joining us. Holger, good to see you. Holger, welcome.
Hello. Sorry, I had to reboot.
Good. Everybody's here. All right, great. We're numbers are 222, and I think that we will wait for another minute, and then we go.
Okay, hello, yes, this is Joachim Schuster.
Very well. Look, I think that we are at 250. I don't know what the numbers we are. This is about 50% of what we had, but I think that by the time we get started, I think probably more people will come in. I'd like to welcome those of you that have joined now and those of you that are coming. This is an open session. Usually our session are on Townhalls rule, but this is an open session. There is press in the room for those of you, just to make sure that we all know that. My name is Andrei Marcu. I'm the director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. The occasion for today is the launch of a study that we have undertaken at the Roundtable for the last 9 months or so, more than 9 months probably, looking at border carbon adjustment in the EU issues and options. Quite clearly a topic that is capturing the imagination and the attention of many these days. It's very much part of the Green Deal, as we will see, and not any part of the Green Deal. We think it's an important element and a necessary condition in the Green Deal. Now, what I will do is I will briefly introduce the speakers so we don't have to do that afterwards. And then away we go. So the way we will do this, there's a keynote address from Director General of Digitaxud, Mr. Gerasimos Thomas. Gerasimos, truly appreciate. We know you're busy. You have quite a few files on your plate, BCA and energy taxation are not minor files. They will get the attention of a lot of people in this town. Then we will, Mr. Thomas will be taking a few questions, time permitting. Then, and those questions we will ask you to send it via chat. In such a, because there are presumably over 500 people, and if we let people in, it may become chaotic. So we'll ask you to send questions via chat, and I'll try and moderate as best as I can. Then we will present the paper, which is the joint work of Mr. Melling, Aaron Cosby, and myself, but not without support from Daryl Dipka and Dana Glotti, our colleagues here at ERCST. And then what we will do is we will get reactions to the paper and in general reaction to the issue of the CBAM from Mr. Joachim Schuster, who's an MEP, a member of the International Trade Committee, SND from Germany. Be followed by Mr. Holger Losch, the Deputy Director General of the Executive Board of the German Business Federation, BDI. We will then have Mr. Robert Jeske, who's the head of Kobice Keki, Mr. Daniele Agostini, the head of low carbon and European energy policy in the Enel Group, the large Italian electric company, global electric company. And last but not least, Mr. Anurag Ghosh, who's the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water in India, one of the better known and influential think tanks in India. Mr. Ghosh will be joining us while in progress because of a family situation. He needs to be a little bit late, but he will be here. So with this, what I'd like to do, I'd like to now give the floor to Mr. Thomas, and thank you again, Gerasimos, for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you very much for inviting me to open this event, and congratulations for the work done and the paper prepared. In terms of way forward, I suggest that the questions to me, I answer the questions after your presentation, because you are supposed to do the most interesting part of the event. So first you present, then I can answer a couple of questions if there is time. Well, I just took up this position, so I'm now in this position now for 6 weeks, started 17th of August. So I think the Commission set out the political priorities, and the President set out the political priorities on the Green Deal, and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is at the center, along with Energy Taxation Directive and ETS reform, at the center of our political agenda on the EU Green Deal. And recently, as you all know, the Commission proposed an increase of the 2030 targets and a new allocation and distribution of these targets among member states, with proposals that will come, legislative proposals that will come next June. So this is a very ambitious and necessary agenda that allows us to reach climate neutrality by 2050, and also allows us to build a new model for our growth strategy in the EU around the Green Deal policies. Since the Green Deal communication was adopted 10 days ago, the Commission has been working to transform the political commitment into actions and legal texts where necessary. We are setting out different initiatives in this area of carbon border, but in energy area, in industry area, in farming, in food, in the biodiversity. It is a complex and necessary endeavor that we are going to address with determination. It is important when we go down that route of climate neutrality to always keep in mind what is happening in international level, and in the short term there is a substantial risk of carbon leakage, and that is what we are trying to address. There is carbon leakage because production is transferred from the EU to outside, or because EU projects are substituted. and we need to look at alternatives to protect or to address this issue of carbon leakage. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a new way, an alternative or complementary way to free allocations in the emission trading systems. Until now, I had free allocations as the main element to move forward, and now we are looking at this new instrument, the new mechanism, as an alternative to the free allocation systems that we had. We have the experience of this free allocation system now for quite some time, and we have to adjust the way we deal with this in the next decade and beyond. Now, a new dimension in our analysis has come into play since July of this year. As part of the next generation EU, the European leaders have decided that the carbon border adjustment mechanism should also become part of the own resources for the EU budget. So any income that will arise out of the carbon border adjustment mechanism will flow into the EU budget, and this is a new dimension that has to be taken into account when we design the instruments, and we move from what you call, what in your paper call political challenges, legal challenges, and design challenges. So in the design challenges, we have to incorporate this factor and let's say quantify this aspect. But before going more specifically into what we are doing from now to June, I think we should clarify, and we should not have any misunderstanding. We have to keep the big picture that the key to reducing emissions and to achieve climate neutrality by 2050 is to have a plethora of instruments. All of them should lead to an increased price of carbon. It's the increase in carbon price that eventually will allow the market to take decisions. So all the measures that we will take, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism, they will support, not undermine this factor. And I think this should remain very much into our minds. Now, the Commission launched in February an inception impact assessment. We had several reactions. Some of you, and certainly the people involved in the study, have been participating and reacted to this. I want to clarify on a couple of issues that I think are important. This is important for us, that any new mechanism complies with international commitments. This is important. The WTO compatibility is an important component of our analysis, and it will guide our choices. The second is that the primary intention of the carbon border adjustment mechanism remains the need to foster international cooperation and to limit greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So this is the overall policy objective, to foster cooperation and compliance with COP21 targets and give incentives to all to adhere with them. And then, of course, this is a transition mechanism that will help us, all of us collectively at an international level, to get there. Now, we also launched the public consultation the 22nd of July. This runs until 28th of October this year. We are gathering views and analyzing the views, both on what we should try to address, but also on which sectors and which aspects, the detailed design of this mechanism and its link and interaction with the ETS. I mean, your report is very timely, because this is really the moment by which we can bring new ideas. This is the moment we can get new analysis.
The presidency has sent a paper on the council asking.
I think I'm going to have to mute people. You have to excuse me. I'm not sure why people are doing this, but I think I'm going to have to try. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Okay. So I think this is important to keep in mind. This will be on the top of our priorities over the next 6 months. We will get the input from our consultations, from our modeling exercise, from our external studies before the end of the year, and we will, let's say, clarify and settle our ideas early next year so as to go with the process that will allow us to come to proposals next June. I think the different options presented of the paper are very useful. We are looking forward to analyze in detail your paper that we first showed yesterday. And I think going forward, what in particularly we would like to get out in the next couple of weeks is to frame the scope of the measure, the territorial scope and the sectoral scope, and also to see the link with the ETS reform and the link with COP21. I will stop here. I think we are very ambitious, and as I said, our policy proposals will be commensurate to overall target of reaching climate neutrality by 2050, and by reaching our targets by 2030, the renewed increased targets. And therefore, this provides a good framework against which to see this border carbon adjustment mechanism in the coming months.
Thank you, Gerasimos. Then what we will do is Gerasimos has kindly agreed that we should go ahead with our presentation, and then take a pause and get some questions from the audience from him, including the panelists, and then we can go on and get the views of the panelists, and then go back into additional questions and answers. So what I will do is I'll go through the trepidation of actually sharing the screen, which is never an exercise that you're sure of, but you're gonna have to tell me, and I hope that we are getting everything that we have. Is this the right, is everybody getting the full screen, or saying BCA and other approaches? These are options, I hope. So I will start the presentation, and then I will pass it on. We will do a ballet with my colleagues, Aaron Cosby and Michael Melling. Now, the issue, what the paper goes into is the question as to why a border carbon adjustment now. In the past, I don't think it's a big secret or a secret in the EU that the border carbon adjustment has not been a favorite topic in the European institution. It just has not been. And maybe the experience that we had with aviation contributed to that kind of view of the world. The fact of the matter is that we are concerned, as Gerasimos has mentioned, about the impact that the carbon pricing as an unintended consequence, that of carbon leakage and competitiveness impacts. Now, according to many of the studies that we've participated in, some of them that we did with Bloomberg, some of them we saw that from Agora Energivende, there is numbers seem to show, I don't know that it's universal, but numbers seem to show that we will probably start running out of free allocation probably towards the end of this 2020s, maybe very early in the 2030s, but it very much depends on the level of the effort. If the cap is getting lowered, and we have clear indication that that train is left the station, so this will happen, then probably this puts more urgency to the issue. If we look at some of the numbers that we have, we think that by with a cap of 50 or the target of 50% by 2030, we think that we will have a cross corrections sectoral factor of 28%. At 55% by 2030, we think it's up to 35%. And that are very significant numbers if you stay with free allocation as a tried and relatively successful, not universally, but relatively successful approach until now. border carbon adjustment is seen as a way of taking picking up the flag and continue to run with it. Now, there is a debate. The debate is what is the exact objective of a border carbon adjustment. There's two schools of thought. One of them is to protect against carbon leakage and competitive pressures. And the other one is to increase the level of ambition. In our view, I think this is not a very useful debate, because it is quite clear that the mechanism itself, the role of the mechanism itself is to ensure a moving toward the level playing field in which the carbon content in products is taxed at the same level, the same amount of money for the same level of carbon, whether it's produced domestically or internationally. Now, the fact that this is a necessary condition in order to make a political decision to raise the cap, that's a different story. But the mechanism itself, this is what it does. There is a political decision. That political decision seems to be being made that will raise the cap. But in itself, the border carbon adjustment should equalize or work towards equalizing the level playing field at 40%, 50%, or 60%. The objective or the function is the same. Now, the border carbon adjustment, which is referred at the CBAM by European Commission documents, is being presented as, for the moment, as 4 different approaches, possible approaches. One of them is a tax applied on imports at the EU border. This could be a border tax or customs duty. That's one way. The second way is an extension of the EU emission trading scheme to imports, meaning that those that import goods will have to hold allowances equal to the amount of carbon embedded in the product. Now, this is something that we've observed and exists in California. There's 2 ways you can do this. If you import things, then you would have to hold allowances. The question is, where do the allowances come from? Do they come from under the current EU ETS cap? Or is there an additional pool of allowances which acts as a reservoir for those that import to buy allowances at the same price as EUAs? It does make a huge difference, because the impact on EU ETS scarcity will be quite significant if you start buying from under the cap. So it is not a minor discussion. The last or the 4th option is the obligation to purchase is a carbon tax at the consumption level or consumption charge. In this case, it is seen as a tax that applied to EU production as well as imports based on a weight. So it will be the number of euros over a ton of steel or a ton of cement or a ton of something. And that is clearly something that will probably work in conjunction with an ETS and with additional free allocation. You give enough free allocation in order to mute the danger of carbon leakage from EU ETS prices. Then you put the consumption charge that everybody pays, and you have a carbon price for those sectors covered by the consumption charge. But that is something that my colleague Aaron will be discussed further. Now, the project itself is not, we're not here to take you through this too much, except to say the fact that it has something that has been quite laborious. We have had stakeholder consultation. Unfortunately, only the first one was face-to-face. The other ones were via the same platform, the Zoom platform. But they were very well attended, and we're gratified for the contribution from all the stakeholders that have participated. What we also have done, something which is probably hasn't been done in other places, is a international outreach via virtual town halls with important EU trade partners, the United States, South Korea, India, Japan, South Africa, Mexico, Russian Federation, and Ukraine. And I welcome our friend Arunabha Ghosh, who has joined us as the meeting started, and I thank him for joining us in the face of other commitments that he has right now. Now, the report itself, it has a certain structure. The structure is the normal introduction, the EU context, talking about the town hall context, then analysis of the border carbon adjustment, how the analysis is carried out, and assessment of other approaches. Other approaches, we have looked at consumption charges and contracts for difference. There are others. And then we look at how different instruments can be used for different thoughts. We came up with fairly imaginative front page. What we're trying to say through this front page is that it is an important component of EU climate policy, and it's something that we need to proceed with caution because we haven't done this before, and I think we need to understand and what the consequences are. As Mr. Thomas has said, the devil is in the details very much. Now, Michael, I'll pass it on to you from here.
Thank you, Andre. This is exciting, fantastic turnout. Thanks, colleagues. So when we started out with conceptualizing how to approach this report, we were, of course, faced with the challenge. A lot has been written about BCAs in the past, but the context had changed. For once now, it was actually starting to take shape, and we knew that this policy process was really moving forward in the real world and not just in the world of theory. We took advantage of the early interactions with stakeholders, our closest circle of funders of this report, and then also the stakeholder meetings with external stakeholders to kick a few ideas around how to best, try to visualize and conceptualize the report, and came up ultimately with very useful feedback with this approach, which is essentially to break down all the various design elements of BCAs and try to evaluate them and allow a comparison of multiple variables that BCAs enable or allow policymakers to choose so that it would inform the debate as it proceeds in Brussels and elsewhere. And our dissection, really in an anatomical way, our dissection of border carbon adjustments allowed us to break it down in roughly 8 to 9 design elements. Each of these then, in order to allow apples to apples comparisons, we evaluated the various options that could be chosen for each design element based on a set of 5 criteria. So it's sort of a multi-criteria analysis. And then based on that, we created some scenarios without really making any recommendations. These were just some theoretical possibilities going forward, as well as a probable scenario based on some of the information that we had seen coming out in statements and documents from the Commission and other players in this debate. And finally, we compare, as Andre mentioned, also with alternative instruments that have been put forward in this policy discussion as ways to deal with some of the same challenges, such as emissions leakage. I think we tortured many of the participants in this webinar already in previous webinars with countless tables. I'll give you an example of one of these tables, how it looks like. Andre, unfortunately, I've been having connection issues, so I can't see what you're seeing, but if you go to the first table.
I have put the table.
Thank you very much. So this is just to visualize how we try to approach the design elements and the various design options. Here in this case, the first design element, which trade flows are covered, imports, exports, a combination thereof, and how we then apply the criteria to the 3 options that policymakers have. And of course, we're talking primarily about an import-only BCA, but there has been some talk also about including exports plus imports. Exports only is really more conceptual. But what you can see is by applying the criteria, we were able to get sort of a first glance heuristic way to visualize some of the strengths and weaknesses under each of these criteria. So the environmental benefits, the competitiveness benefits, but also very importantly, the legal feasibility, the technical and administrative implications, and the political and diplomatic implications. If we go to the next slide, this is where we try to compare the 3 scenarios we built. And again, I want to emphasize there's no recommendation on our part. This was really just based on trying to build scenarios, one in which we assume that the EU is going to be very cautious and try to play it very safe, one in which it's very aggressive in terms of the environmental and competitiveness aspects, and one, as I mentioned earlier, in which we try to feed in some of the statements and indications that we have received so far on what might be a probable scenario. If we then move forward to the next slide, that's where we compare across instruments. Andre already mentioned the consumption charge. which is in fact one of sort of the instruments that are being considered. But there's also been another proposal in the debate, contracts for difference, which would be very specific and targeted at projects for ultra low carbon materials to get those to market to stimulate innovation and scale up production and marketability. And I think the main takeaway again from that exercise, all of it of course is elaborated in narrative form in the report. So each of these cells and colors and so on, you will find much more detail in the report. But I think the main takeaway, and this is something my colleague Aaron will speak about in a moment, is that there is no one silver bullet to achieve the objectives that have sparked, that have in the first place stimulated this debate about a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Neither the CBAM nor the alternatives will solve all problems. Each has trade-offs. And so we will have to talk about combinations of instruments and how to avoid some of the risks and how to tackle or take advantage of some of the opportunities. Handing over to Aaron. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Michael. And like Michael, I'd like to express my excitement that we have such an enthusiastic participation today and an esteemed panel of experts. I'll get right to it. My job is a fun one. I get to take us through some of the takeaways from the process of consultation, the town hall meetings, our own analysis, starting with the town hall meetings. Andre already mentioned this. We hosted a set of 8 meetings, or co-hosted with prominent international partners in a number of countries of particular interest in the context of CBAM, those with a trading relationship with the EU, and a varied mix of OECD and developing country partners. If we could go to the next slide. Some of the takeaways from those town halls we'll share with you here. Of course, they're shared in more detail in the report itself. There were a number of stakeholders. We had government, we had international environmental and national environmental organizations. We had private sector participants. In general, there was an awareness of the process. There was an awareness that the CBAM was coming, but there was, of course, some skepticism that it would ever materialize. And some of this was based on, as Andre said, the experience of the EU aviation levy. Governments in general were more concerned about the mechanism, and they saw it in the context of the Paris Agreement. They wondered whether and to what extent the implementation of a CBAM would be, for example, consistent with the UNFCCC principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, because of course there will be impacts on developing country partners, and how would this be dealt with in the context of a CBAM. The environmental organizations, many of them saw the CBAM as an interesting opportunity for them to try to ratchet up their leverage in their domestic context for more ambitious action in their respective countries. The private sector representatives were of course concerned, but at this point we don't have a concrete proposal what the CBAM would look like. As Michael has said, there are a number of different design elements that have to be sorted out. And so for them, it's a question of waiting to see what the final position looks like before they take a strong position one way or another. If we could go to the next slide. Some of the main messages we took away from the town halls, of course, they were convened across a number of different countries, as I said, differing positions, different stakeholders, different contexts, but there were a few messages that came through quite clearly, and we found common requests or concerns, as it were. First, that there should be some allowance in the final mechanism for crediting existing policies in foreign countries. That is, if there is a carbon pricing regime in South Africa, certainly the CBAM should take account of this when it does the adjustment. Also, there was a desire for some process to challenge carbon intensity default values. That is, we assume that when the goods show up at the EU border, there will not be an attempt to evaluate on a shipment by shipment, good by good basis what the carbon content of those goods is, but rather that there will be some default value used for carbon intensity of those goods. There should be some means for foreign producers to challenge that default value should they be greener than the default. There was a concern about how the CBAM revenues will be used. As Gerasimos has said, they have been earmarked as EU-owned resources. Many of our international partners urged that they be actually returned to them or donated to some international fund, such as the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund, as a way to make up for the fact that there will be impacts in developing countries of the implementation of this tool, and as a gesture of respect for the principle of CBDR, for example. To a country, all of them asked that in the implementation and the design of the CBAM, that there be further consultation with international partners, and I think we can predict that this will be the case. And all of them, or many of them, urged that the CBAM itself not be considered as a sole option for achieving the objectives, that we consider the CBAM in concert or in comparison with other policy options as we have done in our report, for example. On to the next slide. So I'll finish with two sets of key takeaways from the report, key issues. The first is a set of areas where we identified challenges for a CBAM going forward. These will be no surprise to those of you that have studied these issues in detail. The first is trade flow coverage. What do we do with exports? There are a number of EU industries that have a large export component in their production. We know that from a WTO legal perspective, there are problems with trying to include exports in the CBAM. So probably this will not happen. We need to find some other way to protect those EU producers that have a large export component. Free allocation, another key issue. As Andre has mentioned, we know that free allocation is soon coming to an end, but for the moment, it provides a solid measure of security and predictability to those EU producers that are covered under the ETS. And they are not anxious to trade that security and predictability for an instrument that they don't know, which is uncertain in its impacts and may be challenged under the WTO and taken away. So for them, they are lobbying hard that the CBAM not be introduced and free allocation immediately removed, but rather that we see a phase out, a gradual phase out while the regulatory learning takes place. On sectoral scope, it's been mentioned already, we are probably going to see, at least in the initial case, a narrow sectoral scope. Broad coverage would be fine. We could cover manufactured goods. This would be an administrative nightmare. So we will probably see a much more narrow set of goods coverage, including such goods as cement or electricity. The challenges of resource shuffling and other evasion tactics will be important. Resource shuffling simply means that in response to a CBAM, there will be, in the extreme case, nothing will change about the pattern of international production of goods. We will simply see those goods that are already green shifting such that they're exported to the EU, and those goods that are already dirty shifting such that they're destined for consumption elsewhere. This is not the intended outcome. Evasion tactics like transshipment will be important. If there are any country-based exemptions, we can expect to see an attempt by countries which are low ambition to funnel their exports through high ambition countries which are exempted. Revenue use, I've already mentioned, there's a desire among those that are affected by CBAM to see some of that revenue devoted internationally. It probably won't happen. It would be better from a WTO legal perspective for it to happen, as we discuss in the report. And finally, crediting for foreign policies. Again, this was one of the town hall messages. It probably should happen. Otherwise, we are double counting, double taxing those countries or those producers which are already paying a carbon cost in their home countries. But it's a complex challenge. Do we just credit for price-based policies? Do we credit for all sorts of policies? Again, discussed in more depth in the report. If we could go to the final slide, high-level takeaways. Andre's done a good job of explaining that this is happening in the context of EU's higher ambition, and Gerasimos Thomas underscored the fact that the CBAM is one plank in the European Green Deal. And we know that that kind of ambition, that kind of ramping up of ambition is necessary and important. And we also know that it will not happen without some kind of a mechanism or set of mechanisms to deal with the leakage and competitiveness challenges that go along with unilateral action. This brings to the next point. Raising that ambition and solving those leakages problems are closely intertwined. They are two pieces of the same puzzle. And we are not going to see an increase in ambition unless we can find some solution. There are, of course, legal challenges. As Gerasimos Thomas said, it's important to respect the principles of international law, the obligations that the EU has under international trade law. Any effective border carbon adjustment mechanism will violate non-discrimination provisions in the GATT. So the question is, will it be saved by the environmental exceptions also contained within the GATT? This makes it very important that the instrument be focused on environmental ends, that is prevention of leakage, as opposed to being focused on protection of competitiveness. This has implications all the way down the line for how the instrument is elaborated and what design choices are made. We've already covered the fact that complexity makes it more likely that this will cover a very narrow range of products, simple commodities. The final takeaway is, and Michael stole my thunder here, the CBAM is not, in fact, a silver bullet. The EU has pinned its hopes on the CBAM as one instrument that can help it to achieve the necessary and urgently needed ambition that it is currently pursuing. But of course, and there is some acknowledgement of this in the EU process as well, the CBAM cannot be seen as an instrument in and of itself to accomplish these kinds of ends. It must be seen as one piece in a suite of complementary instruments and institutions which will allow that greater ambition and ultimately allow also the process of ambition to result in greater prosperity within the EU. I'll hand it back to you, Andrea.
Yeah, well, I will close and just talk about, in a way, Aaron has concluded, but everything's been said except by me, as somebody else said. But what I would like to emphasize is that in the end, what are we trying to solve here? What are the issues that we're trying to solve? One of them is clearly the continuation of carbon leakage protection. That is something that you will hear from an environmental point of view. The flip side of this is the competitive pressure that comes with this, and that we need to acknowledge and simply cannot ignore. Now, the other thing that is also needs to be taken into account is the impact of free allocation on downstream carbon price signals. If you give free allocation, you to a large degree, you mute the price signal downstream, and that creates some problems because then your whole effort of creating an ETS may not be as powerful or as effective as you want it to be. But in the final analysis, what do you want to do? You want to create a market for low carbon products. You want to create a situation where in price formation, inside the EU, the value of carbon, the amount of carbon plays a role in price formation. How much carbon is embedded in a product should be part of the valuation of that product. We are, through the ETS, maybe other instruments, telling the cement industry, the steel industry, the chemical industry, all the industries, that we want to see low carbon products. And these low carbon products are to some degree available. The problem is that nobody is buying them right now. There is no incentive and economic rationale for that to happen, except in some cases where some clients will demand it, but that is a very, very small and niche market. So what you want to make sure is that there is a level playing field and the value of carbon is recognized. Now, if they are competing with products that have the same physical characteristics as your low carbon products, but they're more expensive, it's a problem. So how do you equalize this? And you equalize this either at the border, because you at the border put the border carbon adjustment and you can equalize the level playing field, or you do it internally. And this is where the consumption charge comes in combination with other things. So this is what I think Aaron and Michael have referred to as the fact that this is not to be seen as one silver bullet, and maybe that cliche is overused, but as part of a framework. And how, as part of this framework, some of this framework would be at the EU level, and it's very well could be that the border carbon adjustment is at the EU level, but some of the other instruments, consumption charges, contract for difference, very powerful in their own right, very well targeted and with very specific function, could come in. But they could happen at the member state level, at the regional level. It very much depends. So the CBAM, which has many advantages, in a way we see it as being able to be used in a selective manner with clear purposes, very much towards products that are commodity-like. Consumption charges ensure a cost of carbon internalized under free allocation, and solve the problem of muting of the price signal by free allocation. But in itself, it does not lead to decarbonization. If everybody pays the same amount for the same ton of steel or cement, there's really not a great incentive to decarbonize. It is more about product substitutions. The contracts for difference will not deliver the function of a CBAM. What they will do is we see it as very much as targeted to projects which are and installations that are getting off the ground, innovating projects that need a contract, a price difference covered in order to get the product to the market. But what we do need a combination of these products. If you think about it, if you are using a consumption charge, if you give free allocation, you have to give enough free allocation. I don't know how much is necessary in 2028. It may be less than we think because maybe industry has decarbonized, or it may in the end break the cap itself. So the question is, if you give enough free allocation, you may end up taking free allocation from the auctioning part. And then going downstream, you put a consumption charge, and these two together then kind of create a level playing field more at the internal level rather than the external level. So these are some of the issues that have percolated. Again, as Michael has mentioned, the likely scenario does not mean is our favorite scenario. The more likely scenario may be something that may happen, but it's not necessarily the best. What we think it is what we base that on is pretty much on the noise and the discussion that we heard from stakeholders in Brussels and elsewhere that this may happen. So I will, with this, I will come to an end of the presentation without, even though I cannot come to the end of the presentation without acknowledging, as they say in American public television, that this was made possible by a contribution from, and this has been quite widely dispersed, is the governments of Germany and France and a number of associations, Fuels Europe and Eurofair, as well as a number of companies, Solvay, Enel, and Heidelberg Cement. So we wanted, you know, as you may see in this combination, we wanted to make sure that it was a fairly even balance and the contribution from is very appreciated, not only the financial support, but and maybe especially the intellectual contribution that they made to the project. So with this, I will stop here. But what we said is that we would allow a number of questions to that will come, and I assume that at this point, Gerasimos, the attraction of you being here is going to overshadow the attraction that we pose, because it's probably easier to call us than to call you. So let's be realistic, and after we take a few questions and answers, we will go to our panelists. So what I would like to try to start with is I'm flipping through our questions in here and trying to see. For instance, Mr. Cooper is asking whether the CBAM proposal is being developed in the context of international politics about trade and also the COP process. And Europe's ambitious strategy will only succeed if other countries follow. To what extent does this planned measure create carrots as well as sticks for other countries? So the question is this something that will create carrots, or it only be related to sticks? We see also a question for Mr. Leon de Graaf from Business Europe. We heard that the CBAM consultation will be published already in December 2020. Can the Director General please confirm if this is the case? Whether the Director General can do this at this point is something that the Director General knows, and we know that there are limitations on how much you can answer. And I will take a third question from Mr. Magnus Nilsson, who says that China recently pledged to be carbon neutral by 2060. Joe Biden's target from US climate neutrality by 2050. How do these commitments lead to the need for a EU CBAM? So these are three questions, if I may, quite obviously not to us, but more to you, Gerasimos, and maybe we'll take a second round, but then we'll move on to our panelists.
Thank you, Andrea, and congratulations again for the debate. I think that we should start, I would like to start by making a couple of comments. First of all, I fully agree with the conclusions of your presentation that the CBAM is not a silver bullet. It is part of a package, and it is very important to highlight this. It is what the Commission and the President agenda has highlighted. There will be the ETS reform, the ETD, the CBAM. So there is a number of elements that form a package that will allow both us to reach in Europe climate neutrality, and will serve as a package of carrots and sticks, as it was stated in one of the questions, you know, to move our partners in the same direction. Second, I find a little bit now going into the comments here and the questions that we get, I find all the questions a little bit on the defensive side. Oh, it will not happen. Oh, it will be difficult. Oh, everybody will be against. And I think that we have to see politically, and I can say this, I had the privilege, let's say, to have a break in my commission career, go back to a national government as a minister. The agenda, the green agenda is compelling. You know, there is no way back, whether it is governments that they will have to move towards sustainable policies, whether it is companies, whether it is the financial sector. So we should not examine everything with the caution lenses. We have to wear optimistic lenses. We have to look forward as we drive policy going forward. We should not look with the rear lens. You know, we don't drive by looking at the rear lens, we drive by looking forward. So with this general introduction, I would say that I will say that you know, it is necessary to look at the international dimension, both in terms of policy consistency and in terms of WTO dimension. So we will look to, we have all this in the framework of COP21 agreement, and therefore we have to look on how our climate policies compare to equivalent policies in other countries. So of course, this dimension of looking at the commitments that other countries have made, and the commitment that Europe has made, how they compare, how they evolve, this is a very important element of the design that we will have. And I think it is a success, answering to question on China. It is a relatively success and satisfactory outcome that China committed to a goal. This goal is not as ambitious as Europe, so comparatively there is room for improvement. And we have to look at the details and how they will get there. But of course, is one of the elements in broad terms that we are looking. We are looking for our partners all over the world to commit to similar dates in a way that we do it, and in a way that is compatible to COP21 goals. So, but the long from now to 2040, 2050 is a quite long one. And so we need to make sure, like in Europe, we need to make sure that we get there and we get to the first stage by 2030, that we need to monitor and give incentives or sticks in some cases to get there, you know, on time and in an accelerated way from now to 2030. I think that when it comes to free allocation, which has been so far the instrument of choice in moving forward, it has to be revised. It's mentioned in a lot of the comments, it has to be revised. Our target has been revised to 55%, and this is the proposal of the Commission. We are confident that the Council and the Parliament will, support this. So by definition, we are moving in a world that it will become more and more ambitious as we move forward in Europe and internationally. And then we will comply with WTO rules. We will try to be even-handed between domestic and imported products. We will try to be fair when we compare imports from different destinations. It is important when you import from China and from India or from South America. And we would, of course, have a system that will be as at least restrictive as possible and in line with legitimate objectives that I have outlined. So I'm not going to give you, some of you are asking concrete details, ideas, studies, numbers. They will come next year. But I think it is very clear the way that we are going to work forward. We are going forward in a way that it is WTO compatible and a way that ensures that gives incentives also to our partners to come closer to our policies and move faster on COP21 commitments. I would also say that this road to climate neutrality, it does not have to be adversarial. It can be cooperative, but then in specific sector, in specific products, in specific companies, there might be consequences for them to move on. And last comment, I think I would say that from your presentation also is important that I'm very happy that you looked at alternatives. For example, the carbon contract from difference. We don't think they are alternatives at this stage. They don't seem also from your analysis to be alternatives to the CBAM, but they are complements that can be used in investment decisions or can be used in other contexts. But it is important to provide the Council and the Parliament the comprehensive analysis, including the alternatives. So I want to commend you on reaching out on this.
Thank you, Gerasimos. Two more things that I may raise, because some of the questions that we're getting are very precise, and I think probably at this stage, without using my own judgment, it's probably difficult for you to answer. You are still at the stage of examination and reflection. But two things is, have you given any thought at all of this is really looking at more in terms of the direct emission, indirect emissions? Is that discussion taking place in what context? And the other thing which is important, which I'm sure my colleague and friend Aruna Bagosh will raise, to what degree is there thinking inside the Commission on international consultation, and how is that going to take place? We know that there's been some briefings happening, but is there anything that you can say at this point, or is it too early?
I think it is too early at this moment. I think we need to find we need to work out and carefully balance the details, the economic and legal complexities on coming up with a proposal that will cover as many sectors as possible, but in a way that will be possible to comply with WTO principles of being fair. And I think that your approach of moving gradually through a number of sectors is probably wise. It has been the status quo when I joined this DG, so that in the analysis, in the public consultations documents, people are looking at this gradual approach, but what will be the starting sectors, it's still up for discussions. And I think how many sectors we will include initially, I think it's important. It's not going to be a marginal pilot project. It is going to be something that will be relevant and will make the system accelerate.
Very good. Look, I think
Coming to the question of publication in December, I am not ready to answer, but of course, as always, we will be transparent. Whether it will be December or January, I don't know, but we will keep, you know, we will keep transparency to our proceedings.
We can't blame them for trying. Very good. Mr. Schuster, talk about the Parliament and the other European institutions. You come from an important committee, very much related to the border carbon adjustment, quite clearly concerned. So can you give us your perspective, please? And thank you very much for being with us today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me here to this interesting debate and necessary debate. I think your report is highly interesting and timely. That's very important. And it gives a good input for the necessary debate. Let me first introduce my role in the interinstitutional process around finding a suitable carbon adjustment mechanism, and then follow up my ideas on which approach might be suitable. I'm the S&D Shadow Rapporteur on the opinion of the European Parliament Committee for International Trade on a WTO-compatible carbon border adjustment mechanism. The opinion will feed into the report of the Committee of Environment, Public Health and Food Safety on the same topic. Let me now lay out my position for you. In the EU, with the ETS, we have determined to use pricing mechanisms to encourage companies to switch to climate-friendly production methods. The problem is that this transformation also entails increased investment and operational costs for business. The reduction of CO2 in production will save the cost of purchasing allowances under the ETS. However, this will not always compensate for the mentioned additional costs. And therefore, there is thus a high risk that foreign companies will have significant cost advantages over European companies if they have neither an ETS cost nor costs of switching to climate neutral production methods. And therefore, I think the primary objective of carbon border adjustment should be to compensate for this imbalance in competition. In order to achieve the most practical solution, carbon border adjustment should first focus on basic industries and sectors that produce particularly carbon-intensive products, not only the cement industry. I think that's not enough. We have to use a broader approach. The reference point for a border tax should be the CO2 content of the products concerned, taking into account, of course, the costs of possible foreign emissions trading schemes or of shifts to production methods with lower CO2 emissions that have already taken place. In all this, care must be taken to ensure that such border adjustment is constructed in a WTO-compatible way. The mechanism is not a product of arbitrary protectionism, but of ensuring that economic incentives to switch to climate neutral production cannot be undermined by misguided international competition. The suggested mechanism is comparable to a custom duty. Custom duties are considered to be EU own resources. The own resources generated could be used to finance an independent body responsible for determining the carbon content of products. I think this can be very helpful if we will see the political resistance of other states, and therefore it might be very fruitful if we have an independent body and not the Commission or other which decide about the carbon content. And the own resources could also create a fund to boost energy transition in least developed countries. The introduction of CBA is expected to result in broad political opposition from countries whose business and exports are affected by the mechanism. Therefore, the introduction must be accompanied by a diplomatically offensive and, as I mentioned before, it might be fruitful if we have an independent body who is responsible for determining the carbon border content of products. The European Union must remain open to negotiations with trading partners affected by the instrument. As soon as third countries implement their own carbon pricing systems, the European mechanism should be adapted to such countries. There is thus a need for regular review and adaptation. A test phase is also possible to enable possible plurilateral negotiations around the topic. For example, the United Nations Environment Programme could be a forum for such negotiations. Should they fail, the mechanism could be implemented within a year. This could raise the pressure on finding a suitable plurilateral solution. In addition to what I just described, I would like to hear your thoughts on the contracts of difference that were evaluated in the report. Do you think they might be compatible with an externalized ETS and a carbon border adjustment mechanism? Because they are at the end, they are a kind of subsidies. Finally, the EU should proactively review and adapt the global trading system in the light of the requirements of the Paris Climate Agreement. The provisions of the GATT that are still valid today came into being in the 1950s when climate protection was not an issue. Today, however, climate protection must be a priority. And I think in a midterm view, it's absolutely necessary to reform also the rules of the WTO. So much for my thoughts on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And after this debate, I'm especially curious to see what proposals the Commission will present at the end in the beginning of the next year. Thank you for your attention.
Andre, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Holger, German industry is very export oriented, and this is a mechanism, a machine that we don't know what is going to happen if put in place. It hasn't been tested. There are a lot of requirements on it, but it may have unexpected consequences for some of your members, in general for the industrial health of Europe. So where do you stand on this?
Yeah, thank you, Andre. First of all, congratulations for this comprehensive study. It provides us with a wealth of insights, facts, and very good thoughts. So I think we will analyze it. And as far I've read into the concluding thought, and I think what I've read so far, there is a lot of good thought in that. Well, EUCOM's announcement for going for at least 55% in 2030 means that, to put some numbers to it, that we have to reduce 5.25 times the amount of CO2 we've been reducing in the European Union between 1990 and 2020 annually. So that's no easy trick. And it really puts pressure on lots of industry companies and processes, because we now have to go much faster. And this in an environment where we are still lacking technologies, ripe technologies, and of course are still lacking the amounts of renewable energy and the amounts of green hydrogen or other means to reduce CO2 in core processes of industry. So this is one thing. By any means, this decision will, in the near future, of course, further widen the gap between the EU and some other important players. I don't want to go into details, but we all know that going for a harmonized carbon pricing at the G20 level is still at large, though there's, well, I don't see a lot of light there. And therefore, we as industry would insist that the current state of play at least would create more need, or a need for stronger carbon protection in the European Union, especially for our export-oriented, energy-intensive industries. I would add another aspect. So what we've seen in the last months was devastating effects of the coronavirus on the capacities of anybody to invest big time in new technologies. So we have to take this into considerations. Companies have been provided with money from all sorts of sources, not to invest in new green or whatever technology, but they needed this money to survive. And I think that companies, countries, and consumers are entering this next level of combating climate change in the world of all shapes in terms of abilities to invest. So this should be part of the political equation. Well, we've been assured by the Commission on several high-ranking occasions that CBAMs would help to protect our vulnerable industries, but frankly, at least we are not at all convinced that a completely new instrument, the issue has been raised quite often during this debate today and on other occasions, with no track record on carbon leakage prevention. We clearly see, if at all, as an addition to existing or other to created or implemented instruments for carbon leakage in the European Union. Well, so what is it that makes our industries largely more resentful or reserved against CBAMs? I would touch a few points. First of all, compatibility. First of all, any CBAM has to be strictly conditional to be WTO compatible and practicable. So this is WTO compatibility is especially for countries with a large exporting activity, and Aaron pointed this rightly so out. It's extremely important that we have a compilation and a verification of product carbon footprints. So we have many products which are very complex, and so we need a method to really get sort of a due diligence on their carbon footprint, and there is no tool for that today. So this is something which has to be developed firsthand. Otherwise, it will be very, very doubtful if we can make any CBAM compatible with the WTO. Second point is symmetry. So far, we understand that the Commission wants to go for an asymmetric mechanism, means only products which are going to be imported into the European Union should be charged based on their CO2 footprint. At least we have a method to measure this. But there is no compensation for products that are produced in Europe and exported to foreign countries. And I think a largely export-orientated European industry has to go for that. We have to have this symmetry, because otherwise we create competitive disadvantages to European industries who are producing for export markets. So we need symmetry here to not only impose additional burdens on European production. Additionality. I think I mentioned it already. We don't see that carbon border adjustment mechanism. I don't want to stress the silver bullet. So, but it's probably the most common word for that. Can replace free allocation, electricity price compensation, and other existing carbon leakage instruments. So next to different designs of CBAMs, we have to analyze additional carbon leakage protection instruments. Instruments we have already, perhaps we can enhance them, change them, modify them. And on the other hand, so carbon contracts for difference have been mentioned. There's a lot of talk in the community about other instruments which might be suitable to help develop a sort of a toolbox to prevent carbon leakage protection under a much more aggressive and fast CO2 reduction scheme the EU has set out to go. Next point, impact assessment. Of course, we need an extremely thorough and comprehensive impact assessment before we come up with any legal legislative proposal. We have to look at practicability. We have to look at geopolitical implications, especially if we look at the current geopolitical or geoeconomic situation. I think it's a no-brainer that we really have to be careful what we do here, and therefore I think it's very very helpful that you had all these town hall talks and gathered views from other parts, from potential or from partners, trade partners of the European Union and its member states. So, well, we will give our input to the EU Commission's consultation. I have to be honest, I was a bit disappointed about the content of the consultation. So there is not much detail. Well, there are 4 scenarios what could be done. It's very broad, but there's not a lot of detail to it. There could be a tax, there could be an extension of the EU ETS, there could be sort of a special importers ETS allowance pool, or a consumer's charge, which is discussed parts of the German government. But there is not much detail to it, and I hope that the consultation and studies like yours will really give the EU Commission an impression on well, how important it is to come up with a very comprehensive and well thought solution. EU has raised the bar to the maximum concerning CO2 reduction. This confronts us, not only us in the industry, but consumers and countries as well, with enormous challenges. And in at a time when the abilities, as I already mentioned, to invest are heavily crippled. So I think this really asked for a smart deal to get recovery and Green Deal together. And I think that protecting our European industry from carbon leakage or from investment leakage, which is even worse, should be as important as reaching the targets. And therefore, we are still not convinced if the approach as we see today will be the last word on that.
Thank you, Holger. You talked about our trading partners. Now, I'm not sure Arunaba is a trading partner itself, but he certainly is has the ear to the ground in one of the largest, they call it the largest democracy in the world, and certainly an increasingly important trading partner. Arunaba.
Thank you, Andre and Michael. Thank you very much for inviting me back to this session. I had enjoyed our conversations in March, and for those listening in, my organization, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, had collaborated with ERCST in June this year to do a consultation with participants from India. So I'm going to dive straight into the content of what you've presented, and it's really rich content. There's a lot there. And I'm going to pick up on some critical international issues. Rather than repeating, arguments I've made in the past, let me get straight into some emerging issues. I think what Mr. Thomas said was very interesting, that don't always have to be a naysayer. You can look to the future, not into the rear window. But with that mind of looking into the future, what are some of the international dimensions we should be thinking about? The first, and this goes back to your report and the presentation as well, that you don't consider this as a silver bullet. But then it is a component, it's a part of a toolkit, it's part of an arsenal of tools that you're going to use to drive greater action within and outside Europe. Nevertheless, as currently structured, it is still a unilateral measure, right? At our consultation in India, a former Minister of Environment, a very progressive Minister of Environment, did call any attempts of this kind another CDM. He called it a confidence destroying measure. But let me move beyond that, because I'm not here to articulate what government of India thinks on it or the opposition thinks on it. I see it more from a global governance perspective. What are the dangers of unilateralism? It's not that we will recede from multilateral bodies. There's a lot of conversation that we've already heard that we want to make it as compliant as possible with the WTO rules, whether it's exceptions under Article 20 or elsewhere. However, what comes to mind is this still going to be a credible threat? Because for any kind of unilateral measure to actually work, the condition that has to be fulfilled is that it will be a tool that will be used should all other means fail. Whether it is consultations, bilateral or plurilateral or multilateral. Now, if that is the case, is the EU ready to go all the way through beyond the pilots, etc., to actually implement these measures rather than just issue it as a credible threat? Because where we are sitting right now in 2020, and looking out over the next 4 or 5 years where some of this might get piloted, etc., it's really being put forward as, look, the EU has a strong green net zero program. It is trying to do things within its borders. And this is a way to nudge better behavior, however defined, in other jurisdictions. So if it has to be a credible threat, either the EU has to go all out with it, regardless of consequences, or the credibility of the threat fails. Could other countries come forward and initiate preemptive actions within the WTO, etc.? Could other countries and major trading partners act unilaterally on other dimensions altogether, maybe not related to trade at all? So that's one thing to remember. That said, is there a way to get more credibility in this? And that's where grand bargains come in. And that's, again, the value of multilateralism. I mean, in a world where we've kind of fallen into a trap that only small groups can come to good agreements, we have to look back on how grand bargains or how big multilateral declarations have been made. It is because everyone gets something out of it. So I would nudge, as a next round of conversations on this matter, even as the intra-EU consultations continue, that are there grand bargains to be struck? Are there other side deals to be made with major trading partners that would increase the acceptability of a CBAM initiated by the EU? Side deals were used in the NAFTA agreement. Side deals were used in the Uruguay round that resulted in the WTO. Side deals have been used, or I would say plurilateral deals have been used, even to get to a multilateral climate deal. So let us not forget the value of grand bargains to get your agenda forward, or as well as remember that for the threat to be credible, you have to be ready to go forward with it regardless of the consequences. The second point I wanted to make relates to some of the issues that have come up in this conversation, but also in some of the other conversations I've been part of, is what does business think about this? On one hand, the simplistic definition or the simplistic response would be that business, of course, at least within the EU, would like it so that there's not leakage. But also there are businesses within the EU who say, well, there is not enough clarity. This might result in unintended consequences. But if you think about businesses outside of the EU, one of the issues that came up in the conversation that we held in India was that there's a difference between company-led measures and sectoral measures. And there's a difference between sectoral measures and economy-wide measures. So how do we value a company, maybe a large conglomerate, maybe which has operations in the EU, in India, and elsewhere, that also has, say, an internal carbon price? But the sector it operates in does not have any kind of sectoral measures. Or how do we look at a sector that has, at least maybe the companies that account for 80% of the value addition in that sector have come together with some voluntary targets, but the country does not have a carbon price. Or how do you take a country that has implicit carbon prices in the form of maybe energy efficiency trading schemes versus explicit carbon prices? So this is the lack of clarity that makes businesses a little jittery as to, even if they are progressive on paper and in action, how might they get treated remains unclear. Two other quick points, and then I will stop. I think one of the previous speakers was just mentioning this, and I want to highlight that again. We have to ask ourselves, has anything changed in this approach, given that we are going through this pandemic? Again, one answer could be, well, the pandemic has nudged us to be even more progressive in terms of our environmental credentials. And I myself, my institution, many others, and of course the EU has come out with strong plans for green recovery. However, there is also another reality on the ground. If you look at the numbers, there are likely to be about 100 million people going back into extreme poverty, as according to the World Bank. And if you also look at those numbers, the emerging markets in the world which were driving the global economy, where the maximum growth rates were pre-pandemic, are now actually lagging behind the developed world in terms of the recovery. Now that will have political consequences in terms of where the jobs will come from and so forth. So one suggestion, again here, as we think about the international dimensions, is how do we consider small and medium businesses and supply chains? Is there a way to create incentive structures that allow for small and medium businesses to actually upgrade their technologies? Again, one of the speakers was saying, in this time, it's very hard to put in that capital investment, and all the work we've done in India, for instance, serving hundreds of small businesses, suggests that those that are tied in with more export-oriented supply chains or with larger conglomerates have a higher propensity to invest in energy efficient or lower carbon technologies than others. But nevertheless, they're still constrained by lack of the upfront capital that small balance sheets don't give you access to. So if we can create, again, in form of a side deal, etc., a way to get the supply chains that involve European companies and non-European companies working in Europe, but have these long tail of small businesses, the effort embedded in the CBAM will not only be environmentally credible, but would also be socially just and politically more palatable. And therefore, my final point is about the user revenue. Currently, it is to subsidize other activities within the EU. I think there's going to be a very strong call from trading partners, especially poorer trading partners, even though the poorest of countries are exempt from the CBAM, to see if these revenues raised could potentially be used as part of the climate financing commitments that remain unmet. You see, ultimately, any proposition will be evaluated and weighed against the list of unmet commitments in a long history of very fractious climate negotiations. So whatever we do should focus on is two things: credibility and trust. If we can get both, I see a better way forward to not look into the rear mirror. Otherwise, the rear mirror and the side mirror and the blinkers will give us reasons to pause. Thank you.
Naba, I know that you thank you very much for staying with us. I know that your situation requires you at some point to move on. I am aware of that. There was one thing that someone asked is, any example of a grand deal or side deal that you might see as increasing the acceptability of CBAM? Let's make this very quick, because I think that...
Yes, I think it has to be, as I mentioned at the closing part of my comments, it has to be a combination of a way to increase the availability of capital for small and medium businesses to invest in these technologies. Because a lot of the larger companies, even if they might not be operating in jurisdictions where there's an explicit carbon price, are already putting in implicit carbon prices within their conglomerates or within the group companies of the conglomerates. And we've been engaging with several of these, and some have come forward very explicitly to say that they are part of various different coalitions, etc. It's the micro, small, and medium enterprises in India, which are in number in their millions, account for 45% of our exports and 40% of employment outside of agriculture. So, they are the skeleton of the economy. So a CBAM, which does not penalize a large conglomerate which has the balance sheet to upgrade their technologies, but penalizes the bulk of small businesses, which also have the bulk of employment, is going to have a massive pushback from the government of any emerging economy, not just India. You can talk to the Southeast Asian economies, you can talk to the South American economies, and you'll get the same answer. So a side deal that focuses on small businesses and helping them upgrade might be a sweetener.
Daniele Agostini.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Naba. I think that was a great intervention. I think it is also in line with one of the concerns that we're looking at here in Enel. And again, for those of you who don't know us, we're a big global utility operating along the full value chain of electricity from generation to retail, and operating in throughout the world, Europe, North America, South America, but also Asia, India, for instance. We're quite active in India. And so we're very concerned with some of these more global and political dynamics that a CBAM could trigger. First of all, some of you may wonder why, as an electricity company, we were so passionate about the CBAM. Well, we think we believe climate change is a real threat and action is extremely urgent. We're pushing for increased ambition and supporting the efforts both of the EU, but also of a lot of governments that we see very active in the Americas, but also in Asia on this. And China has shown some leadership there, true leadership. But we see as a stumble block for increased ambition, carbon leakage and competitiveness issues. And so CBAM can play a key role. On the other hand, we also see some of the carbon leakage starting to happen also in the electricity sector. For instance, in Europe, roughly between 2017 and 2019, we had an increase in imports of 20 terawatts. That's roughly 25 million tons of CO2 per year, which is basically Italy's coal emissions. And we're closing down our coal plants in Italy. It will be quite a pity if, as we close down our coal plants, then we start importing electricity generated from coal from outside. So that's the tack that we're taking in looking at CBAM. We're actually diving into a number of the challenges that a border carbon adjustment may pose with the help of outside advisors, but also looking in the company. Of course, WTO is a key one. Then embodied carbon content is another very important, and we really see the technical issues. But maybe the third most important area is actually engaging with the stakeholders and understanding where the consensus is going. So it's not only legal, it's not only technical, but most of all is finding a common vision. And I think some of the work that the Roundtable has done with these town hall meetings, and thank you, Aaron, for illustrating some of the findings, are very, very interesting to us. And in this engaging with the stakeholders, we actually see the geopolitics of border carbon adjustment being very sort of not receiving maybe the necessary attention. With the NF Foundation, we're actually sponsoring a study with a number of research universities that is looking at how the energy transition is going to change the global energy supply chains. Who is going to come up winner and who's going to come out as a loser in this. And of course, this, in our eyes, is also going to influence who may be opposing CBAMs and who instead may be accepting them. And just to look at the recent developments, I think if you look at how China is positioning itself in the global energy supply chains, the new global energy supply chains, is not a coincidence that they've come up with a pretty bold relaunch of their ambition to 2030 and for mid-century. And so in that sense, very soon, I think we'll be looking right now, we may be thinking of China as a trade partner with whom we would have to explore CBAMs, but I think very soon that will change. And so that, in that sense, what we were just mentioning with Anna, we need to look forward in a dynamic way at what is happening and not just inwards on how we implement it in Europe without seeing what's happening outside. So diving onto your study, thank you for the presentation and thank you for a wonderful study. I think it maps very, very well the issues, and it's going to be a great platform on which we'll have the political side of the debate. And it's going to be an interesting one. The next step, of course, is the design parameters. And I think Michael illustrated some of these. Holger, I think you brought up some of the issues that probably we would have liked to see more about. And as I said, I'm expecting a second season of the sort of BCA study from the roundtable, because it would be interesting to actually start looking at some of the numbers, at some of the actual geographical scope. It gets a lot more difficult. The devil is definitely in the detail. And the level of the tax, how do you calculate the carbon content? From some of our analysis, again, we did it with some outside help. There are no established benchmarks. So the idea of having a default benchmark based on the European emissions could be an idea, but I'm not sure how it would work with our trading partners. So again, I also understand that there's no silver bullet, but I would like to have a better indication of what is the best silver bullet. So there may be more than one silver bullet, but it would be more interesting to get a sense. And for sure, I would see that the more pragmatic first option that you map as probably the most likely one that we should start and strive exploring in more detail to see some of the numbers, because very soon we're going to have to discuss these numbers. Overall, I remain very optimistic. My outlook, I think on this Europe once more is a trailblazer, is really exploring for the first time a very challenging issue. I know that a similar instrument has been implemented, of course, by California. Has had mixed results, but the volumes are completely different, and the jurisdictions that it involves is also very different. So I think it is good that the EU is exploring carbon border adjustment, and even though it's challenging, I think it is feasible. We'll have to focus on specific sectors, as I think your report seems to imply. But I think it's inevitable if we want to raise ambition. It would be nice that everybody raised ambition at the same time. It will not happen. So as maybe a group of countries raise ambition, they may be able to then abolish carbon border adjustments across these countries. Inevitably, I see a connection between CBAM and a rising global carbon price, because they will be connected, and it will be interesting to also see some of these interactions. So I'll leave it to there, just not to, I don't want to cut the debate too short, but thank you very much for a wonderful study, Andre, Michael, Aaron, and all the team.
Thank you. Robert, you work for COBICE, which is the agency. So you would like to hear some of the work that you've done, because I know that COBICE does a lot of the kind of the hard lifting in trying to analyze these things for the government of Poland.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Andre. First of all, congratulations on excellent paper you provided for all of us, and I think it's a crucial moment to start a discussion on different solutions in CBAM. And of course, we are working in the Center for Climate Policy and Center for Climate and Energy Analysis, which is part of the, let's say, Polish governmental think tank. And we analyze only one of the solutions, which I think is most discussed, which is border tax adjustment. But most of all, whatever solution we will take into the reality is that there are different obstacles and pros and cons. And I think that in your paper you pointed excellently differences between these different solutions. And of course, as your paper says, there is no silver bullet. And I think especially because of the worldwide trade commitments and legal aspects, there will be very important to have a global solution and a global partnership in this respect. And so getting into the subject, I think that it's worth to point that the CBAM can be perceived as a mechanism to protect EU competitiveness, especially having in mind the speed of the reduction of the emission that and Green Deal commitments that are ongoing in the EU. So, but the other crucial point in the talks about the CBAM or border tax is that this is a potential source of funding for the modernization, innovation, and just transition mechanism within the EU. So this, as it was said, this is vision in vision. So one vision is to reduce the emission in the EU until 2050 in respect of 2030, which are ongoing discussion we have. But other thing is that we should have a vision how to provide this kind of instruments like border tax or CBAM in the EU, not to have, let's say, disturbances with our main goal to reduce emission and have everyone on board. So therefore, which is quite important, that the introduction of CBAM because of carbon leakage and the reaching the emission from European level to the other regions. So the introduction of CBAM should be considered as a complementary to the ETS, as additional measure protecting not only industrial sectors in the EU, but also as an environmental measure to ensure that the EU commitments on the Paris Agreement are met. I think that this is also worth of pointing, because not everyone is talking about the differences between the let's say putting a tax on the border and not talking why we are putting this, let's say, measure on the border. So that means that these carbon leakage is and the reallocation of the greenhouse gases outside of the EU is counterproductive to the overall EU and global climate policy effort. That's why this CBAM can be treated as an environmental measure. And as we within the EU have a obligation under the Paris Agreement, we should do everything is possible to reach this target. And when the carbon leakage occurs, then it means that we are failing in meeting the targets within the EU. So, of course, one of the crucial things, as well as Commissioner von der Leyen pointed recently, that besides other objectives, the CBAM is also used as a way for enhancing the climate ambition outside the EU. And we think that, and in our analysis, we put the charge only for to reflect the prices differences between the systems that are occurring worldwide and within the EU. In the scheming the CBAM, we should also, in the implementation of the CBAM, during the implementation, we should be also careful and do the in-depth analysis in order to ensure that the right choices are made both in the economical perspective and legal aspects, especially in WTO rules, which is, I think, crucial point in the outside discussion with this instrument in the global perspective. As far as from the economic impacts are concerned, the implementation of CBAM, for instance, in the form of border tax, from our analysis, and it's a kind of obvious things that it caused an increase in the prices of imports in the EU. And in our analysis, the projection of the prices of imported goods in the EU in the sectors covered by the border tax adjustment would be higher by about 1.6 on average in 2030, which is maybe not big, but it's kind of, it can have a huge impact in different sectors. So I think it's, in this context, we should also raise the question, will the CBAM and border tax lead to structural changes in the economy? So apart from the changes in the EU trade balances, border tax will also introduce changes in production structure. So it must be borne in mind that the taxes sectors will develop in the EU. So it grow and have more impact in the overall economy. On the other hand, the remaining sector, which are also in the EU, due to the increase in prices, may slightly limit production. Let's say, in our analysis, it's industrial processing, which is the same time has high added value for the whole economy. So the challenge in this context is what form of CBAM should be implemented in the EU, because from the shape of this CBAM or border tax, it has this shape has a huge impact not only outside but also within the EU. So this negative and undue impact of the non-taxed sectors, and this non-taxed sectors which can be, in general overview, pointed in the non-ETS, for instance. So that we are, let's say, imagine that we are putting tax or CBAM on all sectors which are covered by ETS. So from outside of ETS, we could have some problems, and that is, I think, also important to analyze this during the decision of the development of the future movement with the CBAM. Of course, in our opinion, it should be first, and that's it's common conclusion from your paper and from all the discussion we have today, that we should first test on the smaller scale to fully understand this impact, and see if this mechanism is effective against carbon leakage. First of all, we think that the CBAM should be targeted in some sectors which are mostly prone to carbon leakage, and I think it's also kind of common that this is cement, steel, or fertilizers. We also think about the refineries, but this is also for the future discussion, and see which of this sector is the best, or sectors which are the best for this pilot phase. And I think in this respect, it's also important to start from the Commission side or the business side, the discussion within these sectors, which are most interested in overall, not only in EU, to start this kind of pilot phase. Because maybe we are talking about the WTO regulations problem, etc. But at the same time, there could be a solution that, as we all are under the Paris Agreement, and we see that China is speeding up with the commitments, that it will be maybe not the case. Maybe some sectors are so interested in the global solutions and the reduction within the sectors that that will be kind of silver bullet, but we'll see. So other thing which is I started is that the CBAM or border tax will generate some additional revenues, and you're also pointed in your report that this is estimated around 5 to 14 billion euros, which is the same what like European Commission stated. According to our estimates, it's around 7.6 billion in 2030, which is maybe not so big amount, but enough to start the discussion of what we could do with this kind of cash, we should also use effectively within the EU to meet the overall goals and to reduce the unwanted impacts to the maybe different sectors or overall economy. So I think that besides this economic modeling that does not consider detailed legal and political criteria, it is obvious that the compliance with the rules of WTO and acceptance by other parties could be challenging. But I think as well that it wasn't pointed.
Robert, if we can wrap up, because I think that
I'm just finishing. So it wasn't pointed, so I'm just talking about this impact outside of the EU. So one thing is the WTO rules, let's say, not the problem, but the discussion. But the other thing is that the most, from our analysis, the most impacted outside countries are Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. So the countries that are close from the from the eastern side of the EU, eastern borders of the EU. So it's not only India, China, or United States, but mostly the issue is with the Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So I think this is a crucial point also to have a discussion at closer neighborhood. And I think it's a very, let's say, very excellent job you did that you are make this roundtable discussion with the partners of the EU, which is, I think the results of the discussion should be more developed, and I think it's a, let's say, follow-up of your work. I hope it's a follow-up for your work. So
thank you very much. Listen, I'd like to give the opportunity for a bit of a discussion, but I'd like to start coming back to Holger. The contract for difference is something is like a little German specialty that you guys really like this stuff. How do you, is this an effective instrument to harmonize? Where do you see this thing playing? I'm really interested because I know that in Germany, not only the BDI or you personally, but many of the actors like that. Then I'd like to go to Michael and Aaron. Maybe they want to come back with some question and comments.
Well, we haven't made up our mind yet if we like it. So it really depends on how you design it. So basically, it's about paying companies the difference between their mitigation cost for any technology investment to the actual carbon price. Of course, this can be a very costly issue if you look at the broad range of investments which are needed and the huge amounts of investment which is needed. But it could be, in addition to other things, something which is worthwhile looking at. But to be honest, we haven't made up our mind yet. If we like it, we need some more clarification, and there are numerous institutes, federations, and think tanks are looking into this to give a little more beef to it, because until now it's just a intelligent sounding idea to compensate the gap between the real mitigation cost of an investment and the actual CO2 price. But if the mitigation cost is 450 euros and the CO2 price is 25, you can easily calculate in what dimensions of flow you will get there.
Michael, Aaron, let's try and keep it like pressed, guys. We're almost out of time. I think some people may have to go, but very quick.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I mean, this has been absolutely fascinating, really great discussion. I'll try to hit.
Michael, you see also some.
Sorry?
You also see some of the question on the screen.
Exactly. So that's what I'm going to try to quickly address to maximize sort of the added value from a minute or two. Yeah, I was following the questions in the chat. It's a little bit tricky because there's so much already, but three struck me, and I wanted to give a quick sense of what our research and report suggested, and maybe also open it to the other panelists to see what they think. The first one is something that Arunabha, who I think is still with us, brought up, which is a really difficult question. And that is the fact that, you know, other countries may not have an explicit carbon price, an EU ETS or a carbon tax, which can be easily compared at a numeric level, if you like, with the EU carbon price. And there's two questions also in the chat related to that. What do we do with countries that have chosen to go with performance standards, you know, technology mandates, etc.? But also what is with countries that may have a carbon price only at the subnational level? In our report and research, we felt that trying to estimate, you know, what the implicit carbon price equivalent of non-carbon pricing policies would be is methodologically still too challenging. There's no established single method. There's different ways of doing it. It would be really, really tricky. But I feel that there was a proposal that was made by some colleagues in Sweden at the Kommerskollegiet to kind of reverse the burden of proof, if you like, and give the exporters or the producers abroad an opportunity to document with some sort of process that the EU would have to define what carbon price they're subject to. But, you know, it still would leave a lot of questions, I think, open. Well, and one other thing that I think I picked up in several questions and I think is really worth talking about is the objective. So Mr. Thomas mentioned that, you know, really the objective is to stimulate more climate action globally. In the past, it's been more a discussion about leveling the playing field to prevent emissions leakage. In our report, we took all these elements to be components, if you like, of the environmental benefit criterion. But there is a legitimate question, which of those should be prioritized, which is more important. They're all sort of different aspects of the same coin. And I think it's also there a legitimate debate one can have.
Aaron, from your side?
Well, I picked exactly the same two issues that Michael did to respond to, and I don't have much to add to what he's already said. You'll be happy to hear that given the time constraints. But to just add on to what he said about crediting for policies for implicit carbon prices in policies, non-carbon pricing policies in other countries, we have to remember what the CBAM is adjusting for. It's adjusting for the higher ambition as an adjunct to the ETS. It's adjusting for a raising of the carbon prices within the EU carbon policy constellation. So it is not adjusting for the costs imposed on EU industry by non-carbon price-based policies like the Renewable Energy Directive or auto efficiency standards. These are not being adjusted for, right, on products coming into the EU. So it doesn't make sense to talk about crediting for similar policies abroad unless we also start adjusting for the costs imposed by non-carbon price-based policies in the EU. Then you start down a very slippery slope. There was also a question of how you make crediting compatible with the most favored nation principle of the WTO. Obviously, if you're doing crediting like that, it does violate that non-discrimination obligation in the EU or in the WTO, but there's a very good environmental rationale for it. It would undoubtedly be saved by an Article 20 defense. Just quickly on objectives, as Michael has said, you know, I don't speak for the EU here, but in my mind, carbon, the CBAM is basically about allowing greater ambition to proceed within the EU. It's about making sure that in the context of that greater ambition, you're not disadvantaging EU producers or undermining the environmental objectives of the European climate policies. That does not mean that it is used as a stick to try to motivate foreign producers. That would be a nice side benefit. This is just my interpretation of the objectives. Of course, we can cast them any way we want. And it's important to note that those objectives have consequences. We're much more concerned about resource shuffling, for example, if we include as one of our objectives, changing the behavior of foreign producers. If that's not part of our objective, then resource shuffling is not quite as big of a challenge or an issue. Anyway, great discussion. If we had another 3 hours, maybe we could devote ourselves to the really rich questions posed in the chats here, but time is limited.
Mr. Schuster, you are going to be one of the important key players in this debate in the parliament with your colleagues. you listen to a lot of people, and I'm sure that you listen to a lot of other people between now and then, and there will be no lack of discussions. I think that, one question that I would ask myself is, does this thing address the problem? Does it help climate action? These are, I think, questions that are a higher level, but at some point, they will influence the way we design this and the way we apply this. The question also that is a very fundamental question, because we keep now running around, what is the objective of the CBAM? Now, we initially thought that was to level the playing field. Then we also hear that it is to influence they allow the EU or influence the EU to raise the level of ambition. Now we also hear that is to raise the level of, or kind of encourage others to raise the level of ambition. That if Arunabh Ghosh was still here, I would have asked him directly, because I would be interested to hear what an Indian would say about that. What do you take from this conversation? Because you're obviously listening to a lot of these conversations. I'd like to hear your reaction. You're muted. I'm sorry, if you don't mind.
I think a main point is that CBAM is only one mean to come to a climate neutral production. And it's clear that different states will have different strategies, because we have an alternative, principal alternative than using price mechanisms. It's normal regulation. And therefore we have to find as simple as possible mechanism. And I think the main objective should be leveling the playing field, and not to encourage other states how they should reach the goal. And it would be a little bit complicated, I'm sure, but on the other side, if we have a clear and a transparent system which shows that we only want to come to a fair competition, global competition, that's it might work. And because it's a discussion of what we do with our exports, I don't think that's not the real problem at the end, because our export is not depending on price competition in most cases. We have a competition because our products have a very high quality standard and so on. And that's the main point, and therefore that's not the case. But on the other side, if we have no carbon border adjustment mechanism, we have at the end no steel industry, for example, in Europe, because the costs for climate neutral steel production or reducing CO2 in steel production is very high. Not only investment costs, it could be tackled by the contracts of difference, but also the operative costs will increase, for example, for steel industry. And therefore, we need a protection that not imports can that imports come into a fair competition and not into a price competition where the Europeans cannot win. But it's very important, and therefore I think Mr. Ghosh has said it in a good way. We have to have in mind the perspectives of other countries. Therefore, we need in parallel a diplomatic offensive to explain what we want to do, and to discuss whether we can also help other countries and how we have to change our trade agreements. And I think then we can get also, if we have an CBAM, we can have good trade relations to other countries, not to all. I don't think that we can convince the US government under Trump from such measures, because he always thinks everything is protectionism. Therefore, it will be we will have conflicts around this instrument. But I think if we do it in a smart form, we will have, we can explain to many countries, and therefore I don't think it will destroy our trade relations to most of the countries of the world.
Thank you. Daniele, I will ask you a last question because we share a lot of things, but one of them we share kind of being part in some way at some stage in our life of AIDA, and the fact that we saw a global carbon price as really a solution to this. Have we abandoned that dream or not? Because I mean, if we're going to this, that is signal that we are now, that dream is a little bit put aside.
I think the vision is there, and it's been reinforced by a number of very high level commitments in the last 5 or 6 years at the IMF, at the World Bank. So the vision is still there. The challenge here is defining the transition towards that global carbon price. So I think people have bought in the concept. It is an effective instrument. The question is how we get there. And within that respect, I really believe that CBAM and carbon border adjustment can be a very useful instrument that helps us in this transition towards a global climate, global price on carbon, I would say, absolutely. And I think also AIDA is thinking about it and trying, it does see it in that direction.
Very well. Look, I think that we're at 5 o'clock. There's still over 200 people listening to us, hopefully saying something that is somewhat relevant and interesting, but people have had commitments. So I'm also anxious now not to deplete the panel, especially that I want to thank the panel because it is a very good panel. It was a very good panel. I think to me, the value of the panel comes in one dimension. That dimension is the diversity of views. Does it have a diversity of views? And that's what is important to me. And I think we represented around this table a diversity of views. I think that there could be more, no doubt, there's always more. And we have always tried to reach out to others. If nothing else, ERCST is known as the place where people meet with different views, and any views almost are not out of bounds. Two things that I need to say. One of them is important to us. We are not neutral when it comes to sustainable development, and we cannot, I hope nobody is neutral when it comes to sustainable development, and we are not neutral when it comes to ensure that we have an industrial Europe. I think it's important that we decarbonize but not deindustrialize. That is a very important thing, especially I don't want to deprive Daniele of his customers. That would not be a good thing. So our commitment is to continue to look at this as an objective way as we can. We will regroup after we pop the champagne, after having done hard work over the last 9 months. And it has been, in the end, has been quite a gratifying effort, working not only with Aaron and Michael, but also with the group of funders that have given us very good advice and have allowed us the independence to do what we thought was right. And that doesn't happen always. We will continue our work, and I think the international dimension is an essential one, but there are a number of other things that we have in mind, and some of them have been raised in this particular discussion today. So whether, I don't know what to call it, but this is Netflix session 1. There will be a season 2, Daniele, I hope. And thanking you all again for the participation, but also reminding that there is a team here inside ERCST, Dana and Darek Dipka, who have been instrumental in working hard in putting this together. So again, thank you all for taking the time to join us, and stay tuned. Our next one is an interesting, event that is coming up in a couple of weeks. I think Robert and other organizations and ourselves have done calculation of the cost of the border carbon adjustment on the EU and on other jurisdictions. So we would urge you to also stay tuned and look out for that. It's a much more quantitative discussion, but it should be an interesting discussion. So again, thank you very much, and appreciate your participation and support. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for great initiative.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.